Remedios pressed the envelope against her chest and got off the bus without looking back. Welcome to the Stories Between Lives channel. The town of San Marcos Tezatlan appeared at the end of the dirt road, like a stain of adobe and mesquite. Like all the towns of San Luis Potosi she had never visited, like all the places no one goes to unless they're sent or driven there. Remedios had been sent and driven at the same time. And the difference between the two things was the envelope she carried pressed against her chest with 500 pesos inside, and a note from her mother-in-law that said, "This is so she goes far away and doesn't come back. Sign here." She had signed. That no one was going to take away from her. She was 26 years old, 4 months pregnant, which still didn't show beneath her cotton blouse, and the surname of a man who was no longer her husband, sewn into the documents she carried in the tin trunk she had unloaded from the bus before herself. The surname was Herrera Vidal. The man was Genaro, and Genaro had let his mother put the envelope in Remedios' hands without saying a single word. Sitting in the chair on the hallway of the big house, looking at the floor with that expression of a man who knows he's doing something very bad, but has decided that it's easier to stay silent. Doña Elvira Herrera Vidal had said, in the soft voice she used when she was being crueler than ever, "You were never from here, and what isn't from here has no reason to stay." A neighbor had heard everything from the other side of the gate. He had stood still, looking at the bricks. What none of them knew was that San Marcos Tezatlan had carried that surname engraved in stone since before Doña Elvira was born. Remedios arrived in town with the trunk, the envelope, and nothing else. The main plaza had an old laurel tree in the center and a church of pink quarry stone that was too big for the town. A woman in an apron was sweeping the sidewalk in front of the grocery store and looked at her without asking anything. Remedios stood in the middle of the cobblestone street and didn't know which way to turn. It was then that Don Cayetano appeared. He was a man of 70, with a palm hat and the hands of someone who had carried stones all his life. He was accompanied by his wife, Doña Cande, who was smaller than him and carried a basket of eggs with the ease of someone who has carried baskets of eggs all her life. They both looked at her. They both stopped. "You come from far away?" asked Don Cayetano. "From Matehuala," said Remedios. And she didn't know if that was a lie or the truth, because Matehuala was Genaro's house, not hers. Doña Cande set the basket on the stone ground and wiped her hands on her apron. "And where are you going?" Remedios opened her mouth. She closed it. And then she said the only true thing she had. "I don't know." Doña Cande looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up the basket and said, "Then come eat something first." Don Cayetano and Doña Cande's house was 2 blocks from the plaza, behind a wooden gate that creaked. It had a patio with a stone basin and an orange tree so old that its roots had lifted the floor tiles. There were hens. There was a brown dog that didn't bark but came to sniff her sandals. There was a smell of pot beans and wet firewood that made something in Remedios' chest tremble without her being able to explain why. Doña Cande put before her a clay mug of pot coffee and a pair of freshly made tortillas and didn't ask her anything. Don Cayetano sat on the other side of the table and also didn't ask. The 3 of them ate in silence, or the 2 of them ate, and Remedios tried to eat. And outside, the San Luis Potosi sun fell vertical on the patio, and the hens made their usual noise. "There's a room in the back," said Doña Cande when Remedios finished. It was the boy's, but the boy already left for Monterrey. "You can stay while you find where to be." Remedios wanted to ask how much it cost. Doña Cande moved her hand the way someone shoos away a fly. "There'll be time for that." The room had an iron bed with a mended blanket of blue squares and a small window that looked out onto the orange tree. There was a wooden Christ nailed above the door. Remedios put the trunk on the floor, sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time in 3 days, she didn't have to decide anything. That night, she slept in one stretch, with the envelope of 500 pesos under the pillow and her hand on her belly. The next day, Doña Cande showed her how the morning griddle was heated. It was a black clay griddle, old, with a crack that Don Cayetano had glued with mortar and that Doña Cande simply called the line. Every morning, before the sun came out, Doña Cande lit the fire with mesquite wood and put the griddle on top. And the smell of hot clay was the first thing that filled the patio. Remedios began to get up before Doña Cande to have the firewood ready. Not because they asked her to, because it was the only useful thing she could do with her hands while everything else settled on its own. "You have a good hand for the fire," said Doña Cande one morning, without turning around. Remedios didn't respond, but something in her chest sat down for the first time in a long time. The town of San Marcos Tezatlan was small and without secrets, or so it seemed. The woman from the grocery store was named Concha, and she knew everything that was going to happen before it happened. The man who sold bread from a cart was named Abundio, and he came by every morning at 7. The kindergarten teacher lived across from the church and always swept her sidewalk with a green apron. They all saw her arrive. They all noticed that she stayed at Don Cayetano and Doña Cande's house. No one asked her anything, which is the most elegant way the people of small towns have of asking everything at the same time. One Tuesday, while Remedios was hanging clothes on the rope in the patio, Concha from the store appeared with a sack of beans that no one had asked her for. "I had some left over," she said, and she put it on the hallway and left before Remedios could say anything. On Thursday, Abundio arrived with extra bread. "It's going to go hard if I don't eat it myself," he said. Remedios understood then that this was how the people of San Marcos Tezatlan worked. What she didn't know yet was that those people had a very old reason for treating her this way, a reason none of them had told her yet, because they didn't know if she knew it. The rosary appeared on a Wednesday morning. Doña Cande was cleaning out the chest in the hallway, one of those painted wooden chests that accumulate decades of objects without anyone going through them. She took out old ribbons, a holy card of the Virgin of Guadalupe, 2 letters tied with purple ribbon, and at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of yellowed flannel, a rosary of dark wooden beads with a silver medal. Doña Cande held it a moment, read what the medal said, and went still. "Cayetano!" she called, with a voice Remedios had not heard from her before. Don Cayetano came from the patio. He read the medal. He raised his gaze to Remedios, who was standing in the doorway of the hallway with an apron on and flour on her hands from having helped with the tortillas. He looked at her a long moment. "What's your maiden name?" he asked. "Vidal Montoya," said Remedios. "I'm from Cerritos, but my grandparents were from around here in the Sierra." Don Cayetano and Doña Cande looked at each other. "Come," said Don Cayetano, and he set out walking toward the gate. The 3 of them walked to the pink quarry stone church. Father Lazaro received them in the sacristy, a small room that smelled of old wax and damp wood. Don Cayetano said 2 words in his ear, and Father Lazaro opened a drawer and took out a book of records, one of those with brown leather covers and pages so thin they looked like onion skin. He opened it carefully, kept turning pages, and stopped. But that night, while Father Lazaro spread the book under the light of a candle, Remedios was going to read something that had been waiting for her for more than 40 years. The record said, "Baptism of Eufemia Vidal, daughter of Prospero Vidal and Guadalupe Montoya de Vidal. Godparents, the entire town of San Marcos Tezatlan, as a sign of perpetual gratitude to the Vidal family for the donation of the land where this church was built. Year of 1948. There was a note at the bottom, written in different handwriting, more recent. The Vidal family additionally donated the lands of the atrium and the side chapel. Their name is recorded in the book of benefactors of this parish in perpetuity. Don Cayetano pointed at the line with his finger. Eufemia Vidal was your grandmother, wasn't she? Remedios took her time to answer. Yes, she said finally. That was her name. She never told me much about where she came from. Father Lazaro closed the book slowly. Well, here everyone knows who the Vidals were. This church is standing thanks to your family. Remedios looked at the book. She looked at the rosary that Doña Conde was still holding in her hand. She read the initials engraved on the silver medal. E.V.M. Eufemia Vidal Montoya. And then something inside her sat down definitively, the way a stone settles when it has been badly placed for a long time. That same night, Doña Elvira Herrera Vidal received a letter. Father Lazaro had written it in his old priest's handwriting, on paper with the parish letterhead, informing her that Señora Remedios Vidal Montoya de Herrera had been received by the community of San Marcos Tezatlan as a direct relative of the benefactors of the local church, and that any attempt to deny her civil rights over the assets corresponding to her by marriage would be answered in writing by the town notary, who was also Don Cayetano's son. Doña Elvira never answered that letter. 3 weeks later, a rental car arrived in San Marcos Tezatlan, from which Genaro and his mother got out. Doña Elvira was dressed in black, as if she were going to a wake, and Genaro had the face of someone who comes to do something he knows is going to go badly. They asked in Concha's store where the woman who had stayed with Don Cayetano was. Concha sent them to the church. They found Remedios in the atrium, sweeping with an old broom alongside Father Lazaro and 2 women from the town who had arrived to clean for Sunday's festival. Remedios saw them coming and kept sweeping. Doña Elvira stood in front of her. I came to talk about what is ours. Remedios didn't lift her eyes from the floor. There's nothing of yours here, Señora. The surname you carry belongs to my family. Remedios stopped then. She leaned the broom against the quarry stone wall and looked at her face to face for the first time in her life. The surname I carry is also mine by marriage and belongs to my son, who is on his way. And yours, the Vidal, has been on this stone longer than your family has been in Matehuala. Don Cayetano was standing in the doorway of the sacristy. Don Cayetano's son, who was the notary, was at his side with a folder in his hand. Father Lazaro kept sweeping, without hurry, as if nothing of what was happening in his atrium were any of his concern. Genaro opened his mouth. He closed it. Doña Elvira looked around. She looked at the women from the town who watched her without moving. She looked at the book of records the notary held in his arms. She looked at the church with the surname Vidal, engraved in the stone of the side chapel, engraved with letters 20 centimeters tall that had been there since 1951 and that it had never occurred to her to look for. Sign here, said the notary, opening the folder. It's the alimony document. It's legal. And it's final. Doña Elvira signed without saying another word. Genaro signed without lifting his gaze from the floor. They left in the same rental car. No one accompanied them to the car. No one greeted them when they passed by Concha's store. And Concha, from her doorway, watched them go and said out loud, to no one in particular, they didn't come back. Remedios stayed standing in the atrium a moment after the car disappeared down the dirt road. The women of the town kept sweeping. Father Lazaro picked up his broom. Don Cayetano and Doña Cande went home to warm up lunch. Remedios breathed slowly. She wiped her hands on her apron, and she started sweeping again. Months later, when the baby had arrived and they had baptized him in that same church with the full surname Herrera Vidal in the record, the people of San Marcos Tezatlan kept greeting Remedios in that particular way that towns have of recognizing someone who is already from there. Senora Concha saved her the best eggs. Abundio, the baker, brought her bread before his rounds. The women of the atrium had taught her to knit with 2 needles using sheep's wool. And the orange tree in Don Cayetano's patio that autumn gave so many oranges that they filled an entire basket that Remedios distributed among the neighbors, house by house, with the baby tied to her chest with the blue rebozo Doña Cande had given her on the day of the baptism. Don Cayetano and Doña Cande sat in the afternoons in the chairs of the hallway. The baby slept inside. The brown dog slept at Don Cayetano's feet. Remedios served them pot coffee in clay mugs, and the 3 of them stayed in silence, watching how the golden sun went down behind the mesquite. One afternoon, Don Cayetano said without turning around, "Your grandmother would have been happy." Remedios looked at the rosary hanging on the nail next to the bedroom door, the same nail where the wooden Christ had been before, which was now in the chest because the rosary was older and deserved the more visible place. "I think so," she said. Doña Cande nodded without saying anything, and the sun kept going down. Sometimes that's how the most important things arrive in our lives. Without warning, along a dirt road, with a tin trunk and an envelope with 500 pesos that someone put in our hand, believing it was enough to erase what we are. But what we are isn't erased with money or with documents signed under pressure. It stays engraved in the stone of the places that are waiting for us, even though we don't know it yet. Have you ever found a home where you didn't expect to find it? If this story touched something in your heart, leave your comment and tell us from where you're watching us. Subscribe to the Stories Between Lives channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any story. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that the places where we truly belong are not always the ones we choose at the beginning. Until the next story, a hug from heart to heart. And remember, the surname someone tries to take from you is sometimes the same one the town has carried engraved in stone since before they were born. Remedios looked at the rosary every night before sleeping. And one night, in a very low voice, not knowing well if she was speaking to her grandmother or to her son or to no one, she said, "Here is where we are."